So today I'm going to be making what I think is a pretty accurate tier list of which types in Pokemon are the best and worst in battle. Now, I'm probably going to go mostly off of Gen 7 because Gen 8 has only been out for like a month. So some things have changed. Some types have less representation than they used to. So it makes certain types better or worse. But I think this list is decently accurate. I've been looking into it, looking at what things have uh, most resistances, things that they beat, things that they're weak to. I've been looking at it a lot, and I think this is decently accurate. I'm also looking at how much representation they get, how many of each type is at the top level. Things like that, they all play an account. I think the very worst type is rock. Now, rock, I wish it was better. I genuinely do. But rock has 5 weaknesses, and most of them are pretty relevant. Steel, ground, water, fighting. Very relevant types, especially offensively. You'll see water, ground, and fighting a decent amount. And while steel isn't the most common type offensively, it's a very common type overall, so any Pokemon that is steel and then it just comes in using a steel move is gonna really screw you up. And that just makes rock so much worse. And you'd think to compensate that rock would have a lot of resistances. It doesn't. It has 4. And 4 resistances is pretty decent, but it's not decent when you have so many weaknesses. It resists fire, flying, normal, and poison. I don't really think those are the most useful resistances, especially because normal is only okay offensively. Poison is also only okay offensively, and fire and flying are resisted by more useful types. So rock just doesn't have much going for it defensively, and offensively it's only okay because it does have 4 things that it beats, and you may think that's really good, but 2 of them are ice and bug, and there's much better types to beat ice and bug. And fire and flying, it does beat fire and flying, but ice is better at taking out flying, and water is better at taking out fire. Um, so next is ice. I I think ice. Actually, no, this is wrong. I think next is bug. Bug. It kind of has seen better days. Fairy was introduced, and for some reason, they made Fairy resist bug, and that gets into one of its first problems. It's resisted by steel, just like a lot of types you'll see in the future. Also, rock is resisted by steel. Anyways, bug is resisted by many types, and there doesn't even really seem to be a reason for that, because it only beats 3 types, and the 3 types that it beats, it doesn't need to. It beats grass, psychic, and dark. Fighting is better at taking out dark. Dark's better at taking out psychic. Ghost is also better at taking out psychic. And beating grass isn't really something to brag about. So bug is not really too great offensively, and defensively it's pretty trash. Fire and flying, pretty common types. It's weak to those. It, it's weak to rock, which isn't really that big of a deal, but it's not helping. It's mainly the flying weakness that really hurts it. Being both resisted by flying and being weak to flying, it's just not where you want to be. And the last one in D tier is ice. Now, ice, I do think is better than the other two. A lot of people say ice is the worst type. I don't think ice is the worst type. It might be the worst type if you're thinking defensively, because it only resists itself. It literally only resists itself. It doesn't resist a single other thing. Bug, another thing I didn't mention about it, it has the very useful resistance of ground, but ice wishes it had that resistance. Ice has no resistances except itself. That's extremely disgusting. It makes it quite bad defensively. And it's also weak to fire, fighting, steel, rock. It has quite a bit of weaknesses, so it's just terrible defensively. But offensively, it's really nice. It beats fire. I mean, no, not fire. It beats grass, flying, ground, and dragon. Those are all. They're pretty good types to beat. So having ice, beating all four of those types just in one type with ice is very nice, and that's why you'll see a lot of Pokemon running ice moves, but not being ice type, is because it's so good offensively, but so bad defensively. But also, offensively, it could really use not being resisted by steel. That's another sucky thing about ice. Anyways, next up is C tier. And C tier, you're getting slightly better, but since there's not that many bad types that are like really bad, it's still pretty bad. Now, the first one to mention is Poison. I actually would say before Gen 6, Poison was the worst type, like straight up. But it's gotten some new utility. Defensively, it's actually not that bad. It's only weak to Psychic and Ground. But one bad thing I'd like to mention, Ground is one of the best offensive types. So being weak to ground really does suck. But having only two weaknesses is pretty decent. It also has 4 resistances, which is pretty nice considering that one of those resistances is fighting. And fighting is pretty good offensively, so resisting something like that is quite nice. And it also resists the very good type of fairy and beats that type. See, the reason that poison wasn't that good is because in the past it literally only beat grass. And grass is beat by a lot of other types. But now it beats fairy. And fairy is not beaten by a lot of types. So it's actually quite a niche that it gains from beating fairy and resisting fairy. So that gives it a little something, but it's still not the best at that because the very good type of steel also resists and beats fairy. So poison gets to only be in really C. Now grass is another type that some people put at the very bottom as like the actual worst type. I wouldn't quite say that. First of all, it has a great relationship against water, which is a great type. It beats and resists it. It also resists electric, and it is kind of the only useful type that resists steel, and that's very important. I mean, no, not steel. I'm sorry. I mean ground. It's the only decent type that resists ground. And being the only main type to resist ground gives it a defensive niche as well as resisting the water and the electric. So it resists itself, but that's not really the most useful information. But yeah, resisting all those types gives it a okay defensive use. But it's still not good defensively, obviously, because it has 5 weaknesses just like rock, which is never good. And some of those types are pretty common, like fire and flying. And when it comes to offense, beating water is great. It is lovely that it beats water. But beating rock and ground, it's not that important at doing that. Beating ground's nice, but there's definitely water and ice are better at beating ground. So offensively, it's like okay at best. It's also resisted by steel and flying, which are decently common types. So I'm not even decently common. They're very common. So that's not good. Oh, normal. Normal's the most basic type of all. It it kind of sucks offensively because it's not super effective against anything and it is resisted by steel. It's also resisted by rock, but who cares? But being resisted by steel really does make it a lot worse because otherwise it'd be like truly neutral. But no, it's got to be resisted by steel. Also, being weak to fighting, it's cool that it's its only weakness, but fighting is pretty common offensively. So that also sucks for normal. But it does get a good amount out of just having one weakness. Any Pokemon that is like specially defensive loves the normal type because there's not really many special fighting types. So they get to just tank most hits. But overall, normal being resisted by steel and weak to fighting lets it not be the truly neutral type that it wishes it was. Now B tier. B tier has a lot of types because there's not too many spectacular types or really bad types. So let's just get right into that. At the beginning is Dark. Now Dark used to be probably like an A tier type until Fairy was introduced because Fairy both resists it and it beats it. Of course. Its old weaknesses were Bug and Fighting, of which Fighting was more relevant. So it used to only really have one important weakness, but since it's weak to Fairy now, it's not really that good defensively. Its resistances aren't that important, and its immunity to Psychic is cool, but most Psychic Pokemon pack Fighting Focus Blast as well. So it's not really a useful switch in always. So Dark doesn't always do the best. And offensively, it only beats Ghost and Psychic. So it has a 2 to 3 ratio of types it beats and types it's weak to, which isn't that good of a ratio. And it doesn't really have very useful defensive utility, but offensively, while it doesn't beat that many types, the cool thing about it is it's only really resisted by Fairy anymore, which means it's going to be hitting neutral a lot, which is pretty great. It's really good that they removed its steel resistance. Well, next up is Dragon. Dragon used to be really good. It used to be really, really good until Fairy came in, and that's because Dragon actually had really good offensive utility because although while it only beat Dragon, it was only resisted by Steel. So you have a Dragon type that's like a Dragon Ground type like Garchomp, and it has basically perfect coverage with just its stabs. So Dragon used to be pretty cool offensively, but now Fairy's immune to it, which blocks that. And now Dragon, its only real utility is defensively, being resisting electric, fire, water, and grass, which is a nice pool of resistances. So I will give it that. But being weak to Ice and Fairy also doesn't really help because they're pretty decently common offensively. Um, fighting. Fighting is not the best type anymore. Fighting used to be a very good type. It was only weak to Psychic and Flying. And it was very, very good offensively because it beats 5 types. Now, Fairy was introduced, and that adds a resistance, and it adds another type that it's weak to, So that really put fighting down. But fighting's still there because it still does beat 5 types. And it is the first type to mention that actually beats steel. It's not resisted by steel, it actually beats it. And that's very nice. It's also the only type that beats normal. So fighting is quite a good type, except for it's not that important defensively because its resistances are not special, and it's it's weak to 3 different things. And 2 of them are pretty common in fairy and flying. And psychic's not like uncommon. Psychic's also decently common. But that doesn't provide the best thing for it. And also, it's not the best offensively. It is probably second, because while it is tied for the most amount of things that it beats, it also is resisted by 5 types. It's resisted by like fairy, flying, psychic, bug, and poison. That's pretty yucky. Anyways, next is psychic. Psychic, it's weak to bug, dark, and ghost. So honestly, that's pretty decent. None of those types are like terribly, terribly common. I actually do think it is decent defensively. It like resists psychic too. I mean, it resists fighting. That's what I meant. I don't know why I said it like that. But first of all, having dark being immune to you is not that good. Because while dark is not a fantastic type, it'll still be around. Also, it's resisted by steel, which is always a bad thing. So you have to kind of do a lot of workarounds as a psychic type, and also you're just not packing any real niche. You beat fighting and poison with this type. It's not really something that you need. Flying and ground are better at those jobs. So psychic, while it's not bad, it kind of is left out a lot. Now ghost, I used to think ghost was a lot higher than I put it now, but ghost is decent. The things about ghost is it's only weak to dark and itself, which means that it is probably going to be better offensively than defensively, considering that it beats itself, which is always a weird relationship. But only having 2 weaknesses is really cool. It also has a couple resistances, but more so it is the only type with 2 immunities. And normal and fighting are some pretty good immunities. While normal is not the best type, there's a lot of normal moves. So being immune to all of those is really cool. And fighting is like the second best offensive type, as I've mentioned. So that's also really cool. And offensive wise, it's also pretty cool because it's only resisted by dark. So not many things can switch into a very powerful ghost move. The only problem is, again, it's not too special at anything. What it beats is psychic and itself. While it only has one real weakness, it only has one real advantage. It beats psychic. And beating psychic is not that special. So it's another type that's left out a bunch, and also there's not that many ghost types. So it doesn't get to take advantage of its immunities too often. Um, anyways, next is fire. Fire is quite nice. It has 5 resistances, which is actually the second most amount of resistances any type has. And it's pretty decent offensively considering it is the next type I get to mention that actually beats steel. The only problem with it offensively is while it does beat steel, the other 3 types it beats, bug, ice, and grass, aren't really types that need to be beaten. There is one type that is much better at beating grass and bug, so that's not the best. But fire does have like some good moves like Flare Blitz, so it really does pack some offensive punch. The problem is defensively. While I did mention that it has 5 resistances, when you look at its weaknesses, is water, rock, and ground. Now, rock, that's fine, but water and ground are very common types. So, being weak to them really is a weakness. So, I can't put it any higher, while it does have all those advantages. I would also like to mention that fire type has a weather condition, being drought, which can boost fire type power. Ice also has this, but ice has so many other disadvantages that you're never going to really be using it. But fire, I can mention it. Drought is pretty decent. It can make solar beam better, but mainly it boosts fire type power. And that's quite good, especially because nothing is immune to it, so you can launch these powerful fire type attacks and really lay in the heat. But I just can't put it over because of the weakness to water and ground. I can't put it any higher than B. Now, electric is kind of a one-trick pony. Well, kind of a two-trick pony. It beats water and flying. Two great types. And that's great. And only has one weakness. Only one weakness. Sounds pretty good, right? Well, that weakness is ground. And ground, uh, being weak to ground only makes it even more common. And there's so many reasons to use ground. So ground is also immune to electric. So you just switch in your ground type, you use that stab ground, and you just completely eliminate the electric type. And that's just not the best fit. Electric just gets completely pounded in by ground. And also it's resisted by dragon which and grass. So that's kind of cool because dragon and grass aren't the absolute most common, but the ground immunity really does suck. But the other thing about electric is it doesn't have many resistances of its own. It's only resistant to itself and steel, and resisting steel is pretty cool, but it's not that special. There is a better type coming up that also resists steel, and steel is not the most common offensively. But it's definitely not a bad type. Now we get to A tier. A tier is when we're starting to get really good. Now, if you were looking at the process of elimination, there is only 5 types left. Only 5. But these 5 types are really good. And I've definitely changed my mind about them over time. In A tier, the first one we have is Flying type. Now, in my old tier list that I made when I was like 14, I put Flying in C tier. Well, I think I was pretty dumb back then. Flying is pretty nice. Flying gets a really good thing about it being the immunity to ground. And having the immunity to ground instantly gives it some great defensive utility. When you look at what it's weak to, it is rock, ice, and electric, which honestly is kinda okay because none of those types are extremely common and they're all kind of random. Most Pokemon don't pack these moves randomly. While ice and electric are sometimes used for coverage, you can usually tell when they're going to have ice or electric, which means you can get out of there and switch in when you know somebody's going to use a ground move and then do what you need to do. It also resists fighting, the second best offensive type. So it has a great relationship with both of those types, making it so that flying types can really dance all over them. When it comes to what it beats, being fighting, grass, and bug, these do not seem that special at first, because I've said that grass and bug are not that special, but flying is kind of the reason that they're not that special, and it gets to resist and beat them. So it's actually kind of nice. You'll occasionally see your wood hammer or your power whip, and going into a flying type to just eat those moves up is pretty nice. You'll also see U-turn quite a bit, so flying types eating that up is also pretty nice. So it's really good what relationships it has with multiple other types. Anyways, next in A tier is ground, which is the best offensive type. I've mentioned it offensively quite a bit already, and that's because it's the best offensive type. And when you look at it, it has 5 things that it beats, tied for first place in that category, but it only has 2 things that resist it, bug and grass. And both those types aren't even that relevant. The only things that really switch in on it are flying types, which is really nice that you only have one thing that you're going to worry about most of the time. That's why you can just spam Earthquake half the time. That's why they had to create the air balloon item. That's why they've given so many Pokemon an ability called Levitate, which makes them immune to ground. It's because ground has so much offensive capabilities. So it's always going to be relevant. Also, being immune to electric is nice. And its weaknesses, water, ice, and ground, while it does suck that it's weak to water and ice, if it, we've seen worse. With how good it is offensively, it's gonna be up there. But its defenses do kind of bring it down a little bit. Last is the S tier. These 3 types are the types that I definitely think are the best that are out. And they've kind of been rocking. The first one is Fairy. Most people have been putting Fairy as the second best, or I've even occasionally seen some people put it as the best, but that's very rare because that opinion is a little weird. But Fairy is really good. It beats Fighting Dark. It beats Fighting Dark and Dragon. And all 3 of these types are B tier, but there's a reason that they're B tier. They used to be higher, and that's because of Fairy. So beating these types is actually quite nice. Also, Fairy is resisted by not too many types. It does suck that it's resisted by Steel, but types like ground beating Steel does keep Steel a tiny bit in check, but not too much. So Fairy does get that offensive nerf, but Fairy is so good defensively as well as offensively. Fairy is only weak to Poison and Steel, both not common offensive types. And while it does suck that both those types beat it, they're not going to show up too much, and you get some nice resistances to fighting and an immunity to dragon. So it's pretty nice. There is the weird thing that fire resist fairy. That's not gonna come into play too often, because fire is not really used defensively too much, and fire is just not a super high up type. So fairy is still fine there. It's such a good type. I kind of wish it wasn't, because I don't really like fairy type that much, but I'm just gonna be honest. It's 3-to-2 ratio is so nice. But do you know also has a 3-to-2 ratio, but I think it's slightly better? Water. Water has always been an S tier type in like every single generation. It's very good. It is only weak to electric and grass. Electric is not extremely common, and grass is really not too common. So those are really nice types to be the only types that you're weak to. Also, it's not resisted by steel. It resists steel. Water actually has a decent pool of resistances. It actually has four, which is tied for third highest amount of resistances. It resists steel, ice, fire, and itself. So it's a decent pool of resistances. So water has a decent amount of resistances, and it has some good types that it beats. It beats fire, rock, and ground. Beating fire and ground is quite nice because it really keeps fire in check, and it doesn't let ground types switch in to do all their offensive pain. So water is really up there. And I was debating on whether water or fairy is better because I would say water's weaknesses are slightly less common, I mean slightly more common than fairy's weaknesses, but overall water is better offensively. It has pretty close in good resistances to fairy, but what would put water over the edge is how good it is just like with rain. It has the boost of rain. Any Pokemon that gets up rain, then water becomes so powerful. Because fire type is weakened, that doesn't really help too much. But the main thing is that water gets a 1.5 boost. And that just makes water so much scarier. Water was already pretty good offensively, but water under rain just kills just about every type. Even your electric and grass types are going to be taking some decent damage. So water, it just goes crazy all the time. Water has always been a great type, and you'll see it all the time. But I will say, water does usually need a second type because it usually wants some offensive variety. But that's fine. There's plenty of dual types with water. So anyways, the last and the best type is definitely steel. This is the only type that I would say is overpowered, and if I was to change some things about the types, the only thing that would really need a nerf is steel. Now, steel is not even that good offensively. It beats ice, rock, and fairy, and beating fairy is really nice, but beating ice and rock is not important. So, steel isn't used offensively all the time, but it's still okay. But where it really comes in is defensively. If you look at its weaknesses, firefighting and ground, that seems really sucky at first. But those types are good offensively because they beat steel. Because guess what? Steel resists 12 types. 12 types. There's nothing even close. Fire is second place and resist 5. How many resistances steel has is just the highest number any type has in relation to anything. It has 12 types that it resists. And while it does suck that Gen 6 made it so it doesn't resist Dark and Ghost, it now resists and beats Fairy, which I would say is even better. Steel doesn't have enough weaknesses because it is so good offensively. I mean, defensively. You switch it in on over half these types, and you won't be taking much damage at all. That's why you see so many steel types used, is because how many resistances it has. And that makes it pair so well with so many types. Steel Flying, great type. Steel Water, great type. Steel Fairy, great type. Steel Ground, we've seen that be good. Steel Fire, we've seen that be great. Steel Ghost, Steel, I don't know. It's just all of these. Steel Dragon, Steel Dark, it's worked. The most steel type combinations are really good. And most types cannot say that, except for really the S tier types. So steel is just absolutely ridiculous. Now, this is a uh, OU is the highest tier in Pokemon, which means the best Pokemon that aren't like absolutely ridiculous, so they're banned. And this is how much representation there is in the highest tier of each type. And you'll see that this agrees with my tier list a decent amount. Steel, first place. Water, second place. Fairy and flying. Now you will see that ground. I put ground higher than flying, although flying is fourth place in representation. But that's because flying is better defensively and ground is much better offensively. So it'll take less ground types to do the job. So you'll have your really good ground types and they'll just absolutely destroy. So I do think it is more relevant very slightly than flying because every Pokemon has to adjust for it defensively. So this is all pretty close to my tier list, and you may say that Ghost is at the very bottom, and you're like, why is Ghost not at the very bottom of your tier list? Well, I do think Ghost is a little more relevant overall, and also Ghost just has a very low amount of Pokemon, so it's hard for it to break through and have a bunch in the top of the metagame. So that's another factor. So that was my type tier list. That was very long and also very awkward. But if you have any critiques or some crap like that, just tell me.